Hello there, and today we'll be analysing Dostoevsky's Записки, подполья, and we'll be looking at the first chapter and the title itself.
The book was written in 1864 and we'll be looking at Constance Garnett's 1918 translation. We'll also be using Lawrence Pevier and Larissa Volokonsky's translation, which was published in 1993, for a brief comparison towards the end. So first we're going to do a brief analysis of the source text, paying attention to the issues which it raises, which are relevant to the translator as they translate into English. We're going to cover both questions of function and questions of style in the analysis.
First of all, we must understand that Записки, подполья is an anti-socialist text. It offers an irrationalistic point of view against the prevailing philosophical and political ideas of the time. So from this, one would assume that the function of the text has changed over time, from being that of an operative nature into being that of an expressive nature. However, this is debatably the case, since today a handful of people regard this text as being sacred. So that will not result in the text being really expressive. Whilst considering the main character of the book, widely referred to as the underground man, who is actually an unnamed character, we must retain the character's neuroticism in order to convey Dostoevsky's themes. The translator must convey a sense of hopelessness and a kind of deflated attitude towards the modern world, which is constructed on rationally made utopian ideals. So Dostoevsky's words in translation must sound genuinely human and conversational rather than intellectual, almost robotic.
There's also several stylistic elements which are difficult to, or could be difficult to translate. For example, the novel breaks several novelistic conventions. It's written in a very train of thought, sort of diaristic style. The narrator, the underground man, directly addresses the reader, breaking the fourth wall there. So it's an odd first-person narrative. Not really a narrative in some parts of the book, especially the first, which is more a sort of rant. Which means that also there's questions of vocabulary and syntax linked to this. The vocabulary which is used in the source text reflects the character's own preferences and modes of speech quite a lot of the time, and gives us clues as to how his character develops throughout the book. The register is quite informal, and so we have this diaristic attitude. There's also quite a lot of difficult grammatical points, because the underground man changes his story quite often. He'll say one thing one page and 2 pages later contradict himself or tell you it was a lie. So the translator has to pay a more than usual degree of care to how they translate the grammar and the syntax. Finally, there's also the question of presuppositions. Obviously, Записки, подполья was written in 1864 in Russia, which means that for its intended audience then, they knew a lot of things which the average English-speaking reader today might not. So, for example, things about the cultural context and the linguistic context. So there's an implied need to know about the 19th century Russian civil service, because the underground man was a civil servant. Society, simple things like conversions between monetary units, how everybody's lifestyle was affected by philosophy, religion, and political beliefs.
In the translation of Записки, подполья, there are some conventions that appear in the Russian language that make it quite hard to translate into the English language. Russian has a lot of suffixes, prefixes and infixes which change the meaning of a word very subtly. An example here in the text would be the suffix ka, which appears over here. If you can have a look, Pechenka bolit over here, Pechenka. Ka, or Pechin first of all, is the Russian word for liver. Pechenka is a kind of diminutive, so it would be a kind of awkward translation to say in English, little liver, my dear little liver. There are a lot of other conversational elements that the translator has to bear in mind. The first one over here is the word zhe in Russian, which occurs right over here, right there. Zhe. It's an emphatic particle in Russian, which is very conversational. More examples occur right over here. Нет. You can see that right there. Yeah, нет. which also means none with that, and nusa, right over there. Another example would be the word shtob, which is a shortened way of saying shtoby, which is how you say in order to in Russian. It occurs right over here. Which is how you say in order to in Russian. It occurs right over here.
So the translation we'll be looking at is Constance Garnett's 1918 translation. Constance Garnett was an early 20th century British translator. She translated more than 70 Russian novels in all, including all of Dostoevsky's books, and several of her translations are still in wide publication today. Her motivations were to bring Russian literature to a wider European and particularly British audience, but she was also constrained by her editor, who set her very tight deadlines, so she was often working very, very fast and had no time to revise or rewrite.
And also she was commonly criticised as having made all the Russian greats, all the characters, as having sounded like Edwardian Englishmen. Now we'll be analysing the title itself, which Constance Garnett has translated as Notes from the Underground, stress on the. As you'll notice, in Russian there are no articles, and so this raises the question as to how to translate the actual title itself. You'll notice in later editions it's been translated as Notes from Underground without the. This is an interesting issue since there is no mention of a specified underground in the text itself.
The other key thing we noticed was that the use of idioms, or the function of idioms, is often lost in Constance Garnett's translation. So obviously in Russian there are quite a lot of words with connotations because they're related to idioms or things people say a lot, whereas in English they've often turned into being just a simile or a metaphor. There's a specific example of this when Dostoevsky, or the Underground Man, refers to sparrows. He says, "Я только боровьев пугаю," which literally means I'm scaring sparrows. And in Russian this carries the connotation of, hurting or scaring very delicate, weak things, because sparrows often appear in Russian idioms and sayings and aphorisms as being an example of something very weak and frail. Whereas in English it doesn't have quite the same connotation. So we understand that they are small and weak and it's a bit pointless to scare them, but we haven't got the same cultural context that Russian readers would have of the source text.
To summarise, Constance Garnett's word-for-word style detracts from the underground man's personality, and therefore detracts away from Dostoevsky's psychological, philosophical thriller style.
Several of the untranslatable elements left out, such as the joke or the diminutives or the very nebulous connotations of words like sparrow, but no alternatives are offered in the target text, which leads to a certain loss of the expressive function of the source text, which is of course important as it's a novel. Garnett is also prone to what Berman calls deforming tendencies, especially rationalisation, obviously making the style completely formal. Expansion, she writes a lot more than Dostoevsky did. Qualitative impoverishment, destruction of idiom, vernacular, and the loss of linguistic patterns.
Just as an interesting side note, we would like to compare Constance Garnett's translation with that of Pavir and Vorohonskaya, who are an American man, being a native English speaker, and clearly a Russian lady, a Russian native speaker. And this text was published in 1993. The text is widely regarded as being dynamic and more accurate.
You can see even from the first couple of sentences of the novel they produce some quite dramatically different texts. For example, Vera Volokonskaya captured the slanginess of the original, possibly a bit more than Constance Garnett has, because they said, "I don't know a fig about my sickness." Later on, where Garnett has put in the very old-fashioned ails, "I do not know for certain what ails me," they've used a much more conversational, much more standard phrase of "I'm not sure what it is that hurts me." Hurts obviously means something people say more often. So it's interesting to see how they've dealt with the challenges of that the source text presents. And finally, we've got two very exciting slides of references for you to look at. Here's the references for the reading we did, and the next slide is for the images in the order they appear, because I didn't give them any titles, so we can't alphabetise them. That's enough.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.